Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
We're back with the Formed Book Club. Father Joseph Fessio, S.J. in San Francisco, Vivian with me in San Francisco, but separated by a couple of miles, and Joseph Pierce in South Carolina. We're going to continue Thomas Howard's Chance or the Dance. It's such a wonderful book that we've been leisurely, although intensely, discussing it. And we're going to begin now with Chapter 6, Autocrats, Autonomy, and Acorns. And Thomas Howard has talked about how our imaginative faculty is really what helps us to both derive meaning and express meaning from our experience. But this chapter is extremely significant, I believe, because it's not just, as he says at the very first sentence on page 77, it is not a mere aesthetic shift that has occurred from the old to the new myth. The old myth being that everything pointed to everything else. Its significance meant a sign. Things were signs of other things. The new myth being that nothing points to anything else. It's all just what it is in its particularity. The shift continuing has also redefined for us the way we think about what we are supposed to do. It redefines, in other words, the moral question. It can always be asked of a viewpoint, what difference does it make? So here we are. What difference does it make to have the old versus the new myth? And this is one of the most beautiful descriptions of what freedom is truly that I think you can find in all literature. But I'll leave it now to Joseph or Vivian if you want to take it up from here.
Well, the first thing I want to quote from and discuss is on page 83, so I'll defer to Vivian if she has something for that, or indeed to you, Father.
Go ahead, Joseph, since you have...
No. I want to do something, a long quote from the bottom of page 78. I think this is crucial. 2 lines up from the bottom of the page. In any case, the emancipation of human imagination from this old idea that men, we and the stars and acorns and angels, are all operating in our own different modes under the sovereignty of the whole pattern. It was sometimes called the dance, as though we were all moving solemnly and joyously in a measure, finding our true freedom in the discovery of the steps appointed to us. The emancipation from this idea resulted eventually, of course, in a radical change in our whole idea of what it means to be free. Whereas heretofore, the idea of human freedom was understood as in some way analogous to, say, Shakespeare's, quote, freedom to operate within the confines of a sonnet and come up with something approximating perfection, or the acorn's, quote, freedom to develop according to the austerely limited possibilities of its own being, an enormous oak, or the athlete's, quote, freedom to execute a breathtaking jump by virtue of having subjected himself to a harsh regimen. Now, the idea of freedom involves something more like autonomy. I mean, that's spectacularly good because it gives very concrete ideas of how freedom was seen, specifically in conforming ourselves to the requirements of a certain perfection, as opposed to mere autonomy. So this whole idea... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I may flesh that out just a tiny bit. In other words, freedom used to be understood as the freedom, the agency to do something good. And now when people think of freedom, they think largely of freedom from restriction, freedom from authority, freedom from religion, freedom from tradition. this is a radical change in the understanding of freedom.
And
Well,
go ahead,
sorry.
Joseph. Go
Well,
ahead.
but the quote on page 83 is appertaining exactly to the quote you just gave, Father. But what he's doing on page 78 and 79 there is quoting the stating the principle and the ramifications of the change from one to the other. On page 83, 3 lines down, he gives practical, hard-hitting examples. So he says, the individual is placed at the center of the moral question. He himself is the measure of what he will do, and he himself is the judge. Then he quotes the hippie thing, doing your own thing. But then we have these examples, which, the reductio ad absurdum, if you like. This places the Salvation Army girl, the sodomite, the American Legion conventioneer, the dope pusher, Castro, and Duvalier on an exact par. Each of them is doing his own thing. So, that this is showing what does this actually mean that the state, what you've just read, Father, from 78 and 79, what does this lead to in practice, right? And this is a perfect example of where it leads to in practice.
Right. And segueing from both what you said and Vivian said, we get what we call today the pro-choice movement. The idea is what you choose is not significant. It's the fact that you autonomously make your own choice that counts. Well, you can choose murder, you can choose theft, you can choose generosity, you can choose heroism. But the point is, the motto, pro-choice, is independent of the object of the choice. And that is a disaster. I want to go back to page 82, though, at the bottom, where he says, so, to the new myth now, just as you built your order on the ashes of the old, we will burn your order and build an authentically new one, in which for the first time in human history, genuine freedom will be manifest. So the first time we're going to have freedom. Police, power structures, prejudice, cupidity, these will have disappeared. Defund the police. If it feels good, do it. Antifa, get rid of authority, power structures. This is the inevitable consequence, logically, of this principle of freedom being mere autonomy. But as you say, Joseph, he gives the concrete descriptions of what that means.
Yeah, we watched a couple of days ago The Man for All Seasons for the first time for a long while, and there's a wonderful line in that which I'm going to garble here, where Sun Roper basically says, "I would destroy every law basically to protect the church," and then Thomas More says, "Well, so when you've actually just pulled down all the laws and there's nothing left, and then the cold wind starts blowing, what will you shelter behind?" Right? There's no police, there's no power structures, there's nothing at all to protect you. It's basically the law of the jungle and the law of the most ruthless. Who are you going to appeal to? The police, the law, tradition? There's nothing to appeal to. You're just at the mercy of the most ruthless.
And I think the important thing here in this chapter, because it comes rather late in the book, because at the beginning he's talked about poetry and painting and ritual in our daily lives. But he's really showing, as he said at the beginning of this chapter, that if things aren't connected, if one thing doesn't actually lead to another or depend upon another, and our choices are these atomistic moments in our life of pure autonomy, we're in the abyss. We're in anarchy. We're in chaos.
Yes, that's exactly what he says on page 84. In the middle of the page, he says, "It is the freedom that is imagined by the anarchic point of view and that attributes man's ills to the tangle of chains that held him down like some butterfly enmeshed in a cobweb." Isn't that a great image?
Yes.
And when it's one, what does it look like? Well, we just saw this summer what it looks like with the Chaz up in Seattle. Right? They tried to set up their own autonomous zone. And what ended up happening?
Murder, theft, and
chaos and brutality and murder. Yep.
If we can go back just one page from that, towards the bottom of page 83, the point about all this, of course, it doesn't bring satisfaction. Now, if you can call it freedom if you like, but it's actually a freedom which leads to self-disgust. So at the bottom of the page here, 5 lines on the bottom, there came an iconography of ennui and disgust and anguish. The burden, when it fell from the shoulders of Atlas onto our own, was found to be too heavy.
Isn't that
anarchy? Again, I keep coming back to one of my favourite lines of poetry from Oscar Wilde: "Anarchy, freedom's own Judas." Right? In pursuit of freedom, you betray yourself into this misery.
Well, this is going to get better too. I want to go to the bottom of page 90, but does someone have something before then?
Yeah, I've got something towards the top of page 90.
Okay, go ahead.
So the beginning of that paragraph there at the top, there are no acts of... It's basically talking about Warhol's movie, and every single thing you can imagine as regards sexual exchange, extremely bizarre stuff, freedom, so-called. It says, but no, not everything, not every variety. There are no acts of courage, no acts of generosity, no acts of sacrifice or loyalty, no delight and laughter, no pain or grief, no torment and endurance and desolation, only the murmur of creatures untroubled by the hard distinctions and choices that human beings have to make. And this reminds me of a play that Solzhenitsyn wrote called Candles in the Wind. And the protagonist in that is a highly strung woman who's hypersensitive and therefore sort of suffers all the time. And she becomes a guinea pig of Soviet neuroscientists who basically operate on her brain, and she becomes, to quote the words of that philosopher Pink Floyd, comfortably numb. So basically what they're seeking is oblivion. They're seeking comfortable numbness. They're seeking the lotus flower. And what they're not getting is life. They're abandoning life in pursuit of numbness.
Mm-hmm.
At the bottom of that page 90, a new paragraph, for it is in these limitations on our freedom that the old myth found the definition of freedom. Whatever freedom was, it was to be found ironically via the straight gate. Scriptural reference. It was thought of not as a matter of self-determination, autonomy, but rather, here's beautiful expression, as the matter of the capacity to experience one's own perfection as joy. That's beautiful. Freedom is the capacity to experience one's own perfection as joy, but perfection means reaching your goal, what your nature calls you to be. It constrains you, but the experience of that is joy.
That perfection, ultimately Christ-likeness, requires great sacrifice. I mean, he uses the analogy in various places of the athlete, right? If you want to be the great athlete who jumps further than anybody else, you have to basically live a very, very disciplined life for a very long time to be able to do it. And so that sort of freedom, being the best at something, whether it's being like Christ or being the best long jumper in the world, requires self-sacrifice. There's no path to that perfection which brings joy through selfishness, self-abandonment.
Well, the examples are, almost infinite. But for me, when I go to a concert or symphony, and I think, I can't play an instrument. I tried a couple of times unsuccessfully. But when I hear the violins and the violas and the clarinets and the piccolos and the drum and everything, all those musicians have worked hours and hours, years and years. They say, 10,000 hours it takes to kind of master something. And not only that, they come together. They're not all playing according to each one's own whim. but there's a score there, and even the score is interpreted by the conductor, and what comes out is this incredibly beautiful experience. But you couldn't get that by just getting a bunch of people and, hey, well, here's a violin, give it a try.
Right. Thomas Howard used an analogy there somewhere of, actually it's on page 893 towards the end of this chapter. If you just go to the piano and just hammer away. I mean, our son Leo has Downs, and he has a much better ear for music than I do. He makes a much better sound on the piano than I do, but he's never going to play a tune because he can't read the score. And he's saying, this idea here of put a chimpanzee on a piano, right? He's going to make a noise on it. He's never going to make a tune on it.
Vivian, I want to give you a shot before I come in again.
Well, so going back to this analogy of the orchestra, so this power we've been given in our freedom to say yes, you're being offered the chance to say yes to being the person you were supposed to be. And so that means I'm a violin player, so I'm saying yes to the violin. And it's true that when I say yes to the violin and devote my life to learning how to play it at the virtuoso level, that means I'm also saying no to all the other things I could do with my talent, my time, if I refuse to say yes to the one thing I'm being offered to do, I'm going to end up doing nothing well, nothing good, nothing worthwhile. It's like the power to love. I remember counseling a young man, this was many years ago, who was afraid to get married because then he would be limited to only one woman. And here he was free to love any number of women, and he was giving up that freedom, and now he was going to be limited. And I said, yes, that's exactly right. You're going to say yes to one woman and limit your freedom to her, and by doing that, you will really love. And his eyes popped open, and God bless him, within a few years, I got a letter from him that he had gotten married.
Beautiful.
I mean, again, the irony is it's like a key, right? That you can only really have a full relationship with a woman if you actually get to know her, right? If you're going to dally like a butterfly from one plant to another, you're not actually knowing any woman, really, right? You just a mere surface, it's the superficiality, right? But you've got, if you like, turn the key, which is narrow, to enter into holy wedlock, right? To actually come to know the other person properly, so you can fully love them.
Yes. Which is what the next chapter is about, but I don't want to go there too soon. If you
Not yet, no, because I got two things I want to do on this chapter.
Okay.
Page 91 at the bottom, new paragraph. Again, he is defining freedom from different perspectives. He kind of what Balthasar would call kreisendes Denken, circling thought, seeing different aspects. Freedom in that story then was a matter of uncoerced assent to what was given. There's another definition. Uncoerced assent to what was given, not creating your own false reality, but assenting to the existing reality. Man, unlike the animals, was unique in his liberty to choose whether or not to offer that assent. But there was a scale of values in which freedom itself was not the summum bonum. So freedom isn't the highest good. It was ancillary to the greater matter of perfection. That is, mere self-determination, that is, pro-choice, would have been seen as tragically limiting in that it cut one off from the dance. Your freedom in the dance is to be able to exercise your steps with power and grace, not to decide what you feel like doing. And that's why this book is called Chance or the Dance. Are we in the midst of this arbitrary chaos where any choice is as good as another choice? Or are we invited into the cosmic dance where we've got a role to play, a mission to have that will fulfill us and make us truly joyous? And then, unless someone else has something, I want to read the last paragraph on page 93. Okay. The old myth would have seen all these phenomena of the whole world we experience as images. Images are some paradox that lay at the heart of things, that freedom for a thing is that state in which it appears at its highest performance, its perfection, in other words, and that this is a state that lies on the farther side of rigor and austerity. You've got to have discipline. You've got to reject certain things. And would have seen all these images as suggesting not a moral civility like we're in change for that unique creature man, but rather, here it is, the brilliant display under 1,000 forms of the dance, capital D, which goes on eon after eon, and which waits all breathless with hope for the man, capital M, to recognize the pattern, see his place, assent to it, and join. Notice that progression. For man to recognize the pattern of reality, to see his place in it, to assent to it, and join. He may or he may not. That is his option. That's freedom. But his freedom, another definition here, is the ecstatic experience of the joyous measure whose music rings from galaxy to galaxy. Wow. And Joseph, does that remind you of any particular chapter in one of our favorite authors?
You put me on the spot there.
I'll give you a hint. C.S. Lewis.
Well, I was going to guess C.S. Lewis because he's one of our favourite authors, and I couldn't think of any analogy with Tolkien there. But no, I'm still struggling. Put me out of my misery, Father.
Space Trilogy.
Yeah, but what about it? Sorry.
Second volume. Perelandra.
Okay. Perelandra.
Chapter 17. Which Perelandra is a story of the basically of the temptation to sin on it's Venus, I guess.
It is Venus, yes. Perelandra's the name for Venus.
And the resistance to it. In the end, chapter 17 is this cosmic dance where everyone is at the center and then bowing to everyone else.
Yeah.
For those who are listening or watching, if you haven't read Perelandra, I mean, that should be on your list of essential books before you die. And chapter 17 will be like the climax of a great Wagnerian symphony with the great cosmic dance. It's a perfect, complement to this book.
I agree. Now I know what you're talking about, Father. I agree with you.
Okay. So, what do we do now? I mean, we finished.
I think we have 10 minutes left still. So I think we can begin the next chapter.
Okay. Well, it's a chapter on sex. Let's begin it. Let's see what happens. But we may not finish this chapter. That's what's going to happen. Go ahead.
Well, that's obviously absolutely fine.
I defer to you two when it comes to sex.
Well, I'm not going to comment on that comment, Father. I do have something on page 95, though. If Vivian has something, well, you couldn't be before it, really, unless it's the first paragraph.
It's the first page, so it's hard to beat that. Go ahead.
Well, he mentioned a deep suspicion of the taboos, and one of these days soon, when I get my act together, I'm going to write something in defense of taboos, because the only thing that's taboo these days is the taboo. But the next paragraph, the viewpoint that is being described in this book has nothing to do with Victorianism, if by that we mean a frightened or reluctant view towards sexuality. Indeed, it would probably have to be located at the other end of the spectrum from that, in that it understands sexuality to be perhaps the supreme image in human experience of the way things are. It is at once an ebullient and an austere view. Now, first of all, that's a beautiful paragraph. I think this was written in 1969, at least the original version. I mean, it predates St. John Paul II's theology of the body. But it doesn't predate, of course, ecclesiology, where Christ presents himself as the bridegroom and that we are the bride. In other words, that some of the primal metaphors, and metaphor is not an adequate word for it, but some of the primal images and metaphors that our Lord gives to us about what it is to be in a relationship with him is about marriage. And it's really the other way around, is that marriage gets its meaning really from that and not the other way around, which is why metaphor is an inadequate word for what we're talking about here. So what Thomas Howard's saying here, that sex is not something that we're ashamed of, and we want to sort of, put drape the legs on the piano, as the Victorians are alleged to have done. On the contrary, it's something so beautiful, so primal, so climactic, that it needs to be treated with reverence and deference, and to treat it as something which is beneath that, whether you're a Victorian or whether you're a Puritan or a prurient, right, is not to do justice to the thing itself.
Well, let me ask the two of you, as a celibate to two married people, does it not seem that this view of marriage is so exalted and so mystical and so ethereal and so idealistic that it really does not correspond to washing the dishes and all the other stuff that goes into actually 50 years of married life?
Well, I'll say something. I don't jump ahead of Vivian here, but I want to say this while I'm thinking about it. I think the correct analogy is that to be fully human is to be like Christ. And we spend the whole of our life trying to be like Christ, and we never fully achieve it. But obviously, the more we do achieve it, the happier we are. And so the same thing, insofar as our marriages somehow reflect that relationship between the bride and the bridegroom, that we are happier within the marriage and we are better people and we're closer to God. That doesn't mean, of course, we achieve perfection, but it does mean that the more we approach it, the happier we are.
I would like to, I certainly agree with that, Joseph. Thank you. What I want to point to, and I wish I could find a quote that would sum up what I'm trying to say, the reason why the sexual difference and it's what happens in a marriage with the complementarity of these two differences is so fundamental is because throughout the entire created world, all fruitfulness is the result of the union of opposites. And so this is why it's a sign of something that is fundamental to the whole makeup of life. And this is why the pattern is seen in Christ, in his church, bride and bridegroom. It's seen in the pattern of marriage, husband and wife. It's seen in the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees, that all fruitfulness comes from this union of two different things.
Two things I'd like to say. First of all, you were very sweet in a feminine way, in the best sense of the word, the way you avoided using the word "but" when you were going to disagree with me then, and I love you for it.
No, I wasn't disagreeing with you at all.
No, but you were going to say "but," and I can see your mind working. I don't want to say "but," so you didn't say "but," which I think was absolutely great, and I love it. But the other thing I want to sort of maybe a distinction is that the word opposite. I mean, I prefer the word like a dovetail, right? The two things are different and emphatically different, and they're not the same. But certainly, I have much more in common with a woman than I have with a dog or a butterfly.
Right.
So the word opposite sort of implies something which you can't be further away from it than this. And
well, what you could say, I suppose, instead of using the word opposite, and I agree with you, Joseph, that can give the wrong impression. We're looking at living things on different modalities of male and female, right? And so a man and a woman, they're both still human beings. So they're not opposite creatures, but in their species, they're the different modalities of that species. And that the fruitfulness of that species results when these two different modalities join in a unity, which is going to be one complementing the other. And that's not always going to be easy, precisely because there are differences. There is going to be friction and conflict and part of the flight from marriage that we see in our society is a kind of hopelessness about the ability for these differences to be dealt with in a way that brings about a greater good. When both die to the self, this other greater thing emerges. Both the individual becomes a greater individual, and now the bond that they share is the family and the basis of.
I think, and I love that. I love the way you put that. I think I'm much more comfortable with that, because opposite sort of it implies, or could be seen to imply, dualism, which obviously we don't believe as Catholics. Where what we talk about, I think, is a paradox where complementarity necessitates the existence of difference. Right, so we have to be different in order to be able to complement each other.
Right.
If we don't have that difference, we can't be complementary, and I think that's the paradox.
And so sexuality is the greatest sort of expression of this, but we also see it in the church, for example, the complementarity of the clergy and the laity, right? So like our show here, we have a clergyman, we have married people, we have lay people, we have ordained people, we have females, we have males. I mean, this is where the greatest richness and fruitfulness arises in every aspect of our lives, is when these things can come together in a harmonic whole, not because one is absorbed by the other or dominated by the other, but that both come to their perfection, as we said what the last chapter was all about, the freedom to say yes to your own perfection. Well, they say yes to your own perfection is going to require you to be fruitful in some kind of bringing together you with others in a complementary way. And this is so fundamental to the whole way the world is, that when it gets expressed in marriage, it is this signpost to the way things are. That's why it's kind of the ultimate example in his book of this is the signpost of the way things are.
Yeah.
So Vivian, you raised 4 children through the teenage stage. What do I, as a priest, tell the 16-year-old with heavy hormones? Read chapter 7 of Thomas Howard's book, or just don't do it.
Well, every 17-year-old is a little bit different from the next. Some might read this chapter and get something out of it. Some might not. But the truth is still the truth in whatever form you decide to express it to that particular child. And, sometimes when they would just start to argue and get surly, no matter what you would say at the end of all that, the answer is still no. If you can't understand it, I can't explain it to you. The answer is still no.
Anybody before 97, page 97?
No, no, not me.
Just, a kind of an offhand remark he makes here about almost halfway down. He says, and he's a student of especially English, but also world literature. He says, I know of no serious work of the human imagination which proceeds upon the idea that there is nothing but dalliance in sexuality. And so he's going to kind of develop that in the rest of this chapter. But that's an interesting thing. Are we going to say that everyone who went before us was wrong, especially all the poets, the dramatists, the novelists, that they all made a mistake, but now we, from some higher viewpoint, can, judge them as...
Yeah, higher viewpoint of 35 years of screwed up experience, we can judge the cosmos and
right?
ignore 2,500 years of the greatest writers who have observed humanity.
Well, and to be multi-culty about it, to go back to your word, taboo, Joseph, he says somewhere here about, people he knew who went into the different mission fields, and no matter what tribe and how unclothed they might be, they all have sexual taboos. They all mark out this sphere as something sacred, something different from other bodily functions such as burping and defecating and whatever, every culture, every tribe, every people on the face of this earth has looked at sexuality as something unique, to be honored, to be respected, to be put boundaries around, and so on. This is even beyond the Western civ poets of yore, right? This is universal. This is universal.
Well, I think that we will be able next time to complete this wonderful book, Chance of the Dance by Thomas Howard. And that means that 2 weeks from now, we'll begin Real Philosophy for Real People by Father Robert McTague, good Jesuit and friend of mine. And next week, we'll get back to sex. Thanks, everyone. God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.